Namaskaram to all the panelists at the conference. I'm Durga Lakshmi. I'm an Odissi classical dancer and practitioner. And I come from a background in finance and I'm a chartered certified accountant. My topic for today's conference, as told by Nagaraji, is menstrual practices in relation to contemporary Indian classical dance praxis, yoga and sculpture. I'll move on to my presentation. So that's my topic. Yeah, so I just want to begin with an invocation. Sarva Mangala Mangalye Shive Sarvartha Sadhike Sharanye Triambike Gauri Narayani Namostute. Mede Saraswati Bhare Bhuti Bhav Pravitamasi Niyate Tvam Prasideshe Narayani Namostute. So I've structured my paper into two sections basically. Section 1 is based on the secondary source of Ritu Vidya written by Sino Joseph. Many of them had already discussed it. Why have I based it on the second sources? I found many of it was basically based on both a quantitative and a qualitative research. It was working in my life and I thought it was a credible source to work on. So that's section 1 of my paper, and my contribution to this paper is section 2. That is, it's basically a research critique on the widely implemented interpretation of Karnas by Padma Subramanian. I don't know how many of you are aware of what's happening in the performing arts sector, but she's a well-known name and it's a critique on her paper. Moving on. So while starting this paper, I had a lot of second thoughts and while attempting this paper. And given the pervasion of scholarships such as Padma Subramanian's interpretation of Karnas across dance schools in Bharatanatyam, now we have at a place like Chennai, you have dance schools at almost every street corner. And the average strength is from a minimum of 50 students to a maximum of 350. So no studies have actually been undertaken to understand the medical impact on students' health or the long-term impact. So despite the presentation at various conferences, her paper has been presented at various dance conferences among scholars, yet the basic tenets have never been open to any scope for debate. So I had this dilemma in mind and I contacted the late Kapila Vatsyayan ji in 2020, a few months before she passed away. And luckily, I was lucky enough to get her on call. And it was a very short call. And my question to her was, how comfortable was she with regard to this particular interpretation of Padma Subramanian's? Her response was along these lines: any school of thought must be open to discussion and debate before implementation. Now, this response that I received from her was very affirmative to my questioning mind. And what followed through was a series of informal interviews, discussions, transversing across different Indian classical dance schools. I move on. So very briefly, I'll touch upon section 1 because it's already been discussed by the few presenters. So just stay with me for the next 15 minutes. So in delineating the science behind menstrual practices, Sino Joseph in her book and in my paper, I've looked at into three major heads. One is from the point of view of Ayurveda. Second, the impact on the Apana Vayu. And third, the distinction between visiting temples of Mukti and Bhukti. So how does a Hindu temple impact a human being? The answer lies to it in the science of the chakras. It's divided into two categories, as I said, temples of Mukti and Bhukti. Bhukti mainly relates to our worldly pursuits. So they basically affect our the baser chakras like the Mooladharam, Swadhisthana, Manipuram. Just to give you an example, the Grama Devata temples usually are said to affect the Mooladhara chakra. The temples dedicated to the fertility goddess affects the Swadhisthana chakra. I'm not saying only, but basically the lower chakras. That is what I'm trying to imply. And there is a temple called as the Venni Karumbeshwarar Kovil, which is basically said to cure ailments like diabetes. That basically works around the Manipura chakra. And temples associated with Mukti, which is basically spiritual liberations, work on the higher chakras. This is just to give you an idea of concising the entire paper into two basic heads. How this concept is going to apply in section 2 in performing arts is what is the main content of the paper. So please keep up with me. We're moving on to section 2. So conventional dance praxis in present day context. So a note to the readers. So the distinction between classical and folk is more of a definitional problem. But for the purposes of this paper, I've concentrated on 3 classical dance styles: Bharatanatyam, Odissi, and Manipuri. I've also given a brief highlight as to my journey into the different classical forms, basically Bharatanatyam, Odissi, and also Rabindra Nritya to some extent. So please go through that to understand from what experience I am writing this paper. Okay, dance is a medium of exhibitionism versus dance as a medium of introspection. Present-day praxis of classical dance no longer serve the core aspects of Hindu worship. That's my point of view of ritual transformation and meditation. In the Trailblazers episode of by Priya Kanunga of Kapilaji, which is available actually, she refers to this transition from a ritualistic worship to a performance-based model to an inbuilt temptation of projection, not so much even in the case of music and theater. So what has Padma Subramanian's interpretative model ignored? I answered this question in 4 dimensions. Basically, her model is based on chapter 4 of Bharata's Natya Shastra, termed as Tandava Lakshana. Yes, we had some insights being presented by Ms. Ramaji in her paper. But I want to answer very, very specific questions with regard to debates in this particular model. So I undertake to answer this in looking at it in 4 dimensions. So one is what is the meaning of the term Tandava and Lasya? So in four dimensions. So dimension 1 is praxis of Tandava in the classical dance form of Manipuri. Second, exploration of the terms Tandava and Lasya in the context of Bharata's Natya Shastra. Third dimension is multiple interpretations in the context of Tandava and Lasya, in the context of other literatures, Tandav in the Urdhva Tandava Murti, in that context. So moving on, a note to the readers. So this is basically a note to readers who are referring my papers solely in the classical dance circles. So in conducting my study for this paper, I've relied heavily upon information, informal discussions among dancers, scholars, esteemed teachers of dance schools, published archival interview sources, dance conference recordings, and conversations for the purposes of this study. Where published references are available, I have clearly mentioned them. Further, this attempt is particularly in its nascent stage, and I would also like to add that the conclusions are much subject to discussion. Moving on. Dimension 2. So exploration of the term Tandava and Lasya in the context of Bharata's Natya Shastra. So I have skipped dimension 1. You can read through it in my paper. I'm going to dimension 2, 3, and 4 and my conclusions. Okay. So chapter 4 is titled as Tandava Lakshana. Now, in the context of whether this term Tandava has gender connotations or is it just a grammatical term, it is not signifying any gender connotation was the main question. So in this context, I'm very thankful to dancer Sharon Navanji, who very timely shared me a recording of Miss Kamalani Dutt. It's posted onto my YouTube channel. I've also referenced it in the paper. Now, Kamalani Dutt goes on to explain the term Tandava, but towards the end of the part 6 portion of it, she mentions the term that Lasya, the word Lasya, she says in her words, is not found in Natya Shastra as a technical term. Only mention of Lasya Anga, which is a form of dance done by females. It is to be done sitting. The artist sings the song and also shows the bhava to it. But she concludes saying that Lasya Anga has no connection to Lasya itself. This is her conclusion. Now, though Kamalani ji has said that there is no distinction, there is no gender connotation, I go on to explore this in continuation in dimension 3. So I am going to move on to dimension 3. Okay. So in dimension 3, in same video, she also tells there is a verse in Lalita Sahasranam that goes as Lasya Priya Layakari. So that's the goddess who likes the feminine dance. Then what about Tandava? So if you had also seen Ramaji's video where she says Shivakama Sundari is a witness to the Nataraja's dance. The same context, even the term Nataraja, the form of Lord Shiva, is engaged in cosmic dance. Anand Kumaraswamy maintains that, according to tradition, all rhythm in art corresponds in the last analysis to cosmic rhythms. So, there is multiple definitions, but I'll go again back to the main issue. What are the other interpretations of Tandav and Lasya? So, this sloka is taken from stanza 41 of Saundarya Lahari, and I have borrowed this interpretation from the 68th Pontiff of Kanchi Kamakoti Math, the Paramacharya. So, the verse goes as follows: Tavadhare mule sahasamaya lasya paraya navatmanam manye navarasa mahatandavanatam upabhyam etabhyam udayavidi uddishadaya sanatabhya jagne janaka janani matta jagaditam. So here, in this stanza 41, Devi presides along with Ishvara in the lowermost chakra as Ananda Bhairava and Ananda Bhairavi in the Mooladhara chakra. In the Lalita Sahasranamam occurs the term Maheshwara Mahatandava Mahakalpa Maheshwara Mahakalpa Mahatandava Sakshini. Now, this is from his speech. The reference in this name is to the Samhara Tandava. But in the case of Saundarya Lahari, it is with regard to Srishti Tandava. When Shiva dances his Samhara Tandava, Ambar merely is a witness, is a Sakshini. But in the case of creation, she joins her husband and performs the Lasya dance as a part. That's the thing. So Sakshini in the Sahasranamam, Ambal is a mere witness to Shiva's dance of destruction. So please keep this, with regard to this particular sloka, please keep this speech in the purview of your mind. And next, I'm going to tell what is my conclusion with regard to both dimension 2 and dimension 3. So continuing with dimension 2, if you see the Kamala video, she talks of the distinction between Tandava as Uddata Tandava and Sukumara Tandava. So Ambar's role is mainly with regard to Srishti, and she's a mere witness in the process of destruction. I draw this parallel to the section 1, wherein there is a distinction between Mukti and the Bhukti temples. So in Sino Joseph's book, how mokshadhams affect women of reproductive age, her rationale that she gives is as follows. The simple way to, in her words, the simplest way to understand this is to realize that the process of bhukti and mukti do not go hand in hand. The body of a woman in her reproductive years is inclined towards the procreative process and creation of life, whereas the spiritual process of mukti is inclined towards the dissolution of life to eventually end the cycle of birth and death. These two opposing acts of creation and destruction cause conflict in the physical body of a woman in her reproductive years. Moving on. So a note to the reader. So why have I provided this dimension, especially from Paramacharya's speech, is that while Ms. Padma Subramanian draws validation to her works, intrinsically quoting the pontiff in many of her presentations, it is to be noted here that as per the conventions of the Srimat of Kanchi, their stance with regard to dance practice by female practitioners is not encouraged. This stance of the Mat is a matter of discussion and besides the scope of this paper. But further, from the point of view of the Mat, Shastras like the Natya Shastra are in the periphery as opposed to central roads of the Mat. Hence, the above dimension needs to be read with this discretion in mind rather than taken verbatim. Moving on. So the fourth dimension with which I explore Tandav and Lasya is in the context of this Sthala Purana of the Panchasabai Stalangal. So the Panchasabai Stalangal are Ratna Sabai, Purchabai, Velli Chabai, Tamere Chabai, and Chitra Sabai. We should concentrate only on Purchabai, which is Chidambaram. And what has Padma's response with regard to this Sthala Purana had been and what she has ignored. Okay. So this painting here is the depiction of the Urdhva Tandava Murti, and as shown by Rama also, it is almost a similar context. So the story behind this is that when Shiva performs the Urdhva Tandava, Kali out of modesty does not emulate the same, and thereby she resides as Tillai Kali in the on the outer skirts of Chidambaram. So this is the image of Tillai Kali. This is the four-faced goddess Brahma Chamundeshwari, Ashanta Swarupini of Tillai Kali. I have borrowed this interpretation from Madhusudan Ji's discourse on Panchasabai Stalangal on Chidambaram. So let me tell you what is the science behind this Sthala Purana. So this, when I had a discussion with Miss Jayashri Rajagopalan of Nrityodaya, Mumbai, she had brushed off this, the idea behind the Sthala Purana as nothing but male chauvinism, which is not the case, which I try to explore in this dimension. Along the same lines, Padmaji has also responded in one of her videos, the Bharatiya Natya Shastra episode 4, wherein she responds to a question by a student. And if you see this particular slide, this is the first image is of a depicting a female physiology performing the raising the leg, and the other image next to it is the raise of the leg, like these are called as the Akasha Sancharis. So her response with regard to whether whether women can actually do poses like the Urdhva Tandava Murti, the Akasha Sancharis, etc. Her response was along these lines. So if she says that if the Akasha Sancharis can be done by a female physiology, presumably Parvati can perform them, then why not Kali? This is her rationale, and which is not being debated. But she does not explore the science behind it, as I said. So, given the portrayal of these sculptures, which is which is a female physiology, does it have a medical impact on the female body? That is our key question. So, I draw some points with regard to this episode from a text called Shiva Swarodaya. And this text is basically, it's a fundamental application is to realize the breath as being the medium of cosmic life force. Now, what this verse is verse 387 of Shiva Swarodaya. I'll move on to what is an interpretation of this verse. So, in this section on Samadhi, in the text Shiva Swarodaya, it is stated how the Apana Vayu undergoes inversion when practices that lead to samadhi or moksha are undertaken. The Hatha Yoga Pratipika also states something similar. This is the basis of why we have so many rules for women of menstrual age from doing specific forms of yoga, intense dhyana, chanting moksha mantras like the Gayatri mantra, or visiting moksha dhams, even if they are not menstruating at the time of undertaking these activities. These processes disrupt the menstrual cycles of women, causing an inversion of the Apana Vayu. The menstrual difficulty manifests accordingly to the extent of the intensity of the practitioner's methods and the ability to sense the subtle changes before it snowballs into something much bigger, where we are at the mercy of our gynecologists for answers where we don't have any answers with regard to causes for endometriosis. Again and again, I see evidence of why the spiritual path for women is not the same as that for men. By imitating the sadhana for men, women are unnecessarily putting their bodies in conflict. This particular interpretation was again borrowed from Sinoji's Facebook post dated 29th November 2021. Moving on. So what are my conclusions? If we analyze the episode of Kali and Nataraja in the above light, Kali not lifting her leg might not just be an act of modesty, but also owing to her prakriti, the prakriti of a female physiology in its essence. Given the number of years a tradition or a school of thought is imbibed by a practitioner, no studies, I repeat, no studies have been undertaken on different schools in Indian classical dance pertaining to parameters like blood count levels, bone densities of students, or tracking of period cycles over the course of studies, maybe 7 years, 10 years or so. Compounded with it, the performance-based model, as opposed to a ritualistic-based model, needs changes at the root level. What I mean by that is menstrual leaves, arranging substitute performers. Dance drama performances also need to make these changes to give priority to a woman's health as opposed to performance perfection. Moving on. So, here, if you see this particular slide, this is the Karana named to be Ganta Sochi, and in her book Common Codes of India and Indonesia, she has exactly emulated the sculpture as it is. Now, where is the benchmark as to what is appropriate for emulation of sculpture and what is not? I draw my own conclusions, which again are subject to debate and discussion in the next slide. So in arriving at the benchmark at what is appropriate with regard to emulating sculptures, I'm giving my conclusion. Art needs to be approached inside out as well as outside in, but most importantly, inside out, as through a better understanding of the body, the impact of posture, the workings of the spine can be internalized and its impact felt rather than gross adherence to pedagogies, thereby preventing any long-term impacts on our health. My concluding remarks have covered most of it in my paper, but I shall be going to only three major points. The way forward, going beyond performance-centric models. Moving on. So going beyond performance-centric models. Now this, I shall finish in a few more minutes. This is an example of basically a school called as Sridevi Nrityalaya, wherein an episode titled on YouTube, Tapasya episode 49, ironically, it's titled as Importance of Introspection. Now, here you see in this, especially the second picture, wherein she's this student, this girl aged probably around maybe 5th standard, is doing a pose called as Dvipada Viparita Dandasana. Now, you have this, what to say, a large scale emulation of these yogic poses done at a very, very large scale. And students, teachers, parents are almost in a state of oblivion, not really understanding what are the medical implications. Maybe you don't have it at the moment, but it's definitely going to snowball into something bigger, as Miss Synergy had stated. So students, I asked students of dance schools, teachers and parents need to look beyond these performance aspects alone to understand the severity of a pedagogy has on the body of the dancer, rather than gross, unquestioning adherence to form and subservience to your teachers for the purpose of getting performance platforms. Please don't do this. Going on, conventionally, okay, at least with my knowledge in Bharatanatyam circles, flexibility, this perfect physiology, and the need to look, vanity. So conventionally, flexibility implied perfection in physiology, compounded with vanity being a staple in Indian classical dance, are hurdles that need to be crossed. This picture over here is basically an image of a dancer who's actually lifting 2 times her weight, and it is worded as follows: lifting 2 times my body weight in a hip thrust, one of the foundation strength workouts to making perfect geometries in Bharatanatyam. This is an instance of how dancers are putting their bodies at risk with sheer negligence to long-term impacts, and also advocating the same to others. Her post also reads, follow the story and more on how to achieve perfect lines of movement when you dance in coming weeks. So, going beyond the conventions in Indian classical dance, the obsession for a perfect physiology can analogically be drawn to the documentary Bikram, Yogi, Guru and Predator. Next, avoiding the herd mentality. With this, I'll be concluding. So drawing from the, nobody has pointed out this, but there are a few papers, and especially one paper, which was Dr. Bindu Shankar of Ohio State University, wherein she had pointed out, and another paper wherein Miss Padma Subramanian's paper is an unpublished thesis by Annamalai University. Now, what are the reasons that they have not gone towards publishing it? She has self-published it under her own banner, that is Nrityodaya. So there are limitations to this particular way. I'll tell you how. There is this particular documentary called as At the Heart of Gold, inside the USA gymnastics scandal, wherein this was basically against the team Dr. Larry Nassar, and how he has been, going about his crimes of sexual misconduct for the last 20 years, which came to light much later. So the highlight of this case was Nassar's reputation as a well-connected, talented doctor won their trust. It also helped secure their silence. The story of Nassar is not a story of silence. The story of Nassar is that of an edifice of trust, so resilient, so impermeable to common sense, that it endured for decades against the allegations of so many women. Now, what are the parallels, if you ask, in this particular case, is that if you see the documentary, there was a case that was filed by Miss Amanda at Michigan State University against this particular person, Larry Nassar. And Michigan State University actually conducted an investigation. This investigation was supposed to be independent, but Larry Nassar was allowed to appoint four members whom he actually knew, basically, 4 other investigators whom he actually had known before. And as a result of it, there were 2 reports which were parallelly generated. And mind you, this is one of the this came as one of the most important points in the civil litigation. 2 reports that were generated, one having page 22 given to that person who filed the complaint, and another report having from 23, which was given to Larry Nassar. So in that particular report, that report was very confidential. It was only between the dean, it was between Larry Nassar, and it was between the committee conducting this investigation, which had, the liability that the university has to face and things pertaining to that. So the review process here was not very transparent. Like that, we are emulating, Doctor was Narcissus' supreme and founding lie. What allowed him to continue on to this honorific in 1993. He received a doctorate in osteopathic medicine from Michigan State University. MSU, of course, went on to protect and pay Nasser, the almighty and trusted doctor, as a faculty member for 20 years. In other words, what I'd like to say by this analogy is, I ask readers to look beyond the mask of titles, doctorates, awards, develop an attitude to discern independently and objectively question the impact of a so-called pedagogy may have on your body and its long-term impact without following the herd mentality. As I come from a finance background, I'd also like to point out one more issue, that in a place like India, where in finance, where analysts and critics go on to question the policy decisions of even maybe the RBI governor over interest rates, etc. Why do we do this? We're not doing this because we want to do it. We're doing it because these are very important policy decisions where we're going to see the impact monetarily. So when it comes to a field like performing arts, why are we silenced? Why have we been silent for so long? Why have these tenets not been open for debate at conferences? So I have written this paper in pursuit of truth, and I hope that it is a paper that will be useful to people in my fraternity to question some underlying tenets. And going forward, we're able to create a healthy environment for women and children and artistically mold them to a better future. Thank you so much.
Naresh sir, you are in mute, I think.
Yes, sir.
One moment.
Any questions? Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't ask any questions.
Naresh sir, you are on mute.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
My mute and unmute control is Srinivas hand. Now yes, unmuted.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, now am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So, Lakshmi ji, I was telling that was a very well done, well argued paper.
Thank you, sir.
Where actually we are not competent to agree or disagree with the conclusions that you are drawing.
I agree. It's open for debate and discussion. Purely, it's open for debate and discussion.
But that is a model for complex papers. The papers have to have arguments, papers have to have evidences, papers have to have counter arguments. That way it is a well argued and well evidenced and well reasoned paper. And okay, thank you very much for that. And
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nagaraj ji, Sumedha ji, Harikiran ji, and Srinivas ji also. Thank you very much.